In 2014, a diver in China found an oyster that was bigger than his entire hand. It was almost perfectly round and weighed over 5 pounds. But what made it really special was what was inside of it. The oyster had formed a pearl bigger than a baby. It was the largest pearl ever found! And it's just one of many that this particular oyster had produced throughout its life. When most people think of oysters, they picture small, rough, salty-tasting bivalves that you need to slurp down during happy hour. They don't usually conjure up images of elegant gemstones. But despite their humble reputation, oysters are actually highly prized in the pearl industry, which raises the question, how do oysters make pearls? To answer that, we have to take a little detour into the ocean to talk about a microscopic animal called a polyp. No, not that one. Not yet. That's a Portuguese man-o'-war. We're talking about a completely different kind of polyp. These tiny animals live underwater and have stinging cells. They're the same kind of animal that make coral. But unlike their coral cousins, polyps are soft-bodied. They secrete a calcium carbonate shell to protect themselves from being eaten. And some species live their entire lives underwater, floating along with the current. These drifting polyps are the ones that make pearls. And while their shells are incredibly small, their impact is huge. It's all because of the way their shells form. As the polyps grow, their shells increase in size, but only at the top. The bottom of the shell stays the same, forming a cone shape. If enough of these shells accumulate in one place, they can build up into a massive structure known as a bed of nails, consisting of millions of tiny shells pointing upwards. And when I say tiny, I mean tiny. Even the biggest bed of nails is only about half an inch thick. So how do those tiny shells become those big, beautiful pearls? Well, it's all about the layering. Each time a polyp adds a new layer to its shell, it leaves behind a thin line of nacre, or mother of pearl, which is made of aragonite and conch. Aragonite is a crystalline form of calcium carbonate, and concholine is an organic protein that helps bind everything together. Now, nacre isn't just pretty to look at. It also happens to be extremely tough. In fact, scientists believe that nacre is one of the strongest materials on Earth. It's tougher than steel at resisting cracks and better at absorbing impacts than Kevlar. And that toughness comes from the way each layer of a cella is structured. The individual crystals are all aligned in the same direction, so they work together to absorb energy instead of breaking apart. The layers are also slightly offset from one another, which prevents cracks from spreading through the material. Oysters are basically the architects of nacre, and they use it to line the inside of their shells. But they also gather nacre from the environment. When an oyster eats, it filters out particles suspended in seawater, including the shells of smaller animals. These shells are mostly made of aragonite, which oysters can reuse to create new layers of nacre in their own shells. That means every time an oyster forms a new layer of nacre, it's taking advantage of the same properties that made the first layer so strong. So, the more layers of nacre an oyster has, the stronger it becomes. This explains why some oysters can live for decades. They're constantly adding new layers of nacre to their shells, which makes them tougher and tougher with age. But it's not just the number of layers that determines an oyster's strength. The quality of the layers matters. If conditions are right, the oyster can produce thicker, higher quality layers of nacre. For example, if there's plenty of food to go around, then more oysters will survive to adulthood, and those that do will be able to make more. The ideal conditions also depend on the species of oyster. Some, like the Pacific cupped oyster, are better at filtering out food particles from the water. Others, like the Atlantic jackknife clam, burrow in the sand, which protects them from predators. And some, like the Kumamoto oyster, have learned to adapt to warmer waters by growing larger shells more quickly. Each of these adaptations helps the oyster thrive in a different environment, which means there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to pearl quality. But regardless of where they're found, all oysters share one thing in common. They're incredibly resilient. Thanks to their many layers of nacre, they can withstand incredible pressure, which allows them to grow bigger and live longer. In other words, they're the perfect candidates for making pearls. It took millions of years for nature to figure out how to make nacre, but once it did, it created a material that's changed the world. Nacre has inspired new materials for bulletproof vests and self-healing concrete. It's even helped engineers develop lighter, stronger components for spacecraft. And it all started with a tiny polyp and a bed of nails. This is the host. And this has been How Do Oysters Make Pearls? Do you have a question about the world you'd like us to answer? Submit it below and it could become a future episode.